Okay, hello, British and American culture class. I know it's been longer than usual because of the delay last week. There is another Cyber Campus outage. I think it's supposed to be next weekend, so that's going to be something like April 22nd, 23rd. So make sure that you're not trying to watch the videos when we don't have the CNU portal's not up. I want to talk about today, just to continue talking about Queen Elizabeth and then sort of end at the beginning of the 17th century. So wrap up the 16th century today. I think this will be a shorter lecture because I'm going to do one more, the Wednesday lecture for this coming week. And that's going to be about the 17th century. That's going to be only about the end of the 16th century to the end of the text, to the end of the chapter. As I said, to page 120. We won't get to page 120 today, though. So Queen Elizabeth, as I said, the kingdom, when Henry VIII left it, there's really two things, I guess, that he left for his successors. Two good things. We talked about a lot of bad things that happened. One of them is that the power of the crown, King Henry himself, had solidified the power of the king because he was a very powerful person. And as I said, a lot of people were afraid of him. So the authority of the crown, of the king or the queen, was very secure. The other thing is he did manage to have a son, and that was his obsession. As we said, that was the king's great matter. So in those two things, he succeeded. But otherwise, you can see the beginnings of these five problems, like I said. Plus, there's the royal personality one, but that depends on who the actual king or queen is. But these five things that we talked about in class, they start under Henry VIII, and they continue to cause problems, and they get worse they get worse over time. And then when there's a ruler who can't balance them, then the kingdom is going to rip itself apart and have a civil war. Basically, these are the five things, root causes, you might say, that cause England to transform itself by fighting over the principles of politics and religion. What can I say? It's the maybe the greatest thing that Queen Elizabeth achieved was the fact that she stabilized a kingdom that could have easily descended into factional fighting. We did start sort of this period with the War of the Roses, right? In 1453, the Hundred Years' War ended and England lost, and then it had a civil war between two houses, the Lancasters and the Yorks. And Henry VII, Henry Tudor, he was the winner. So there's actually people alive. When Henry VIII dies, there's still some people alive that remember what that was like. So the last thing that they want, really, is to go through that terrible war period of famine and starvation and uncertainty. So, as I told you, Edward becomes the king, but he's only 9 years old, and he doesn't last very long. He's very Protestant, and him and his uncle managed to make some progress in transforming the church and transforming English society, but then he dies. Mary comes to the throne as the oldest sister, and she's Catholic, and her mother was Spanish, remember? Father was Henry VIII, and her mother was Catherine of Aragon, so she has a lot of Catholic she's fully Catholic, completely devoted to Catholic religion, and she's also really sympathetic to the Spanish because the English never really treated her well. But nonetheless, she does become the queen, and she is the rightful queen, and she is supported by especially English Catholics. Unfortunately for her, or fortunately for the Protestant English, she also dies within about 5 years. So she gets nicknamed Bloody Mary because during her reign, she killed so many Protestants. it turns out that she really didn't want to kill them. She just wanted them to become Catholic, like convert back to Catholic. But because many of these people were very serious about being Protestant and were willing to die rather than change back to Catholic religion, they refused. And when they refused, she killed them. And she burned or hanged hundreds of people. So because she died and Elizabeth came to the throne and she was Protestant, everybody remembers that her attempt to change England back into a Catholic country as a very dark 5-year period. And again, when Queen Elizabeth becomes queen, they're a little bit nervous of having a woman being the queen because they think that a Protestant king would be the best situation, but that's not what they get. However, they probably get something better in the end because Elizabeth is famous for her ability to compromise. So she, as I said, she sort of makes the Anglican Church inside and its practices more Protestant, but she keeps the bishops and she keeps the structure of the church and some of the vestments and some of the ornamentation and stuff. She's okay with that. And she said there's a famous quote attributed to her where she says, I don't make windows into people's souls, meaning if you go to church and you in public follow the rules of the Anglican Church of England, but you're personally Catholic and you do it in private in your own house, then that's not my business. So that was her attitude. So she preserved this balance between the more radical reformists, which eventually will become Puritans, but the sort of moderate Protestants that are Anglican, and these, excuse me, these high church Anglicans who want the Anglican Church to be just like the Catholic Church, and then the Catholics themselves. But the Catholics, the real Catholics, the numbers get smaller and smaller because, I said, the Pope decides to excommunicate Elizabeth, and when he does that, that means you can't, if you're a Catholic, you can't follow the Queen. So you have to make a choice between being Catholic or being English and following the Queen. And most people decide that they're going to follow the Queen and abandon their membership to the Catholic Church. Thomas More, as you remember, he was one of them that said, no, I'm not going to give up my membership of the Catholic Church to commit to the king. And as a result, he was killed. So what are the Elizabethans like? Well, Queen Elizabeth, although she was poor, I told you, she went around to rich people's houses and made herself at home as much as possible, partly because she wanted everybody to see her and she wanted to know what people thought, and she wanted to impress people, but fundamentally because it was very expensive to hold a court in London all the time. So if she moved her court across the countryside in good weather in the summer, the wealthy people would have to pay to host her court, and that would that would reduce her budget, her spending quite a bit. One thing that she's very well known for is her patronage. Even though she's a woman, patron usually means a wealthy man who supports other people. But she was the greatest patron is always the king, right? If you need somebody to support you with wealth, money, materials, men, politically, you need to find a patron, somebody more powerful than you. And always the greatest patron is the king or the queen. So this is the system of, especially for artists, the way that you would get paid for your work would be to find a wealthy person who valued your work. Primarily, in the past, an even greater patron than the king or queen is the church. If you go to the cathedrals, Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel in Rome, his patron was the Pope. The patron was the church, and some of the most beautiful art that Western civilization has ever created comes from the patronage of the church. which is one of the reasons why when England became Protestant and they decided that all the ceremonies and decoration and festivals and you know um, celebrations in the Catholic Church were bad, and they destroyed a lot of this art. It was really a tragic loss, of beautiful artwork that going back hundreds, in some cases thousands of years. Um, and in the name of ideology, they destroyed these things. Um, Radical religious people do this in a lot of religions, not just Christianity. They try to destroy things that they think represent a period or an idea in their religion that is not true or different than theirs. So they were the radical reformists and the radical Protestants, the Puritans. They were very zealous. They were very enthusiastic, and they took it to the point of actually destroying things that we would put in museums or we would consider almost priceless now. But a lot of that stuff was destroyed in England because of that movement. That started under Edward, and it continued throughout Elizabeth's reign. But one of the things of this, one of the effects of the sort of decoupling of the strict rules of the Catholic Church, controlling the community and controlling behavior, and regulating what people were allowed to read or speak or say, is that new kinds of poetry exploring human ideas rather than religious and spiritual ideas only started to proliferate. The printing press allowed the English Bible to be printed in many vast quantities. They could produce many times more. When the Lollards were trying to make English Bibles, they were copying them by hand. But now William Tyndale is printing Bibles, by the thousands. And so even though Henry VIII tried to burn all those Bibles and stop it, by the time Queen Elizabeth is the queen, there's no stopping it, and it's not illegal anymore. English Bibles are legal, and they're being printed, and everybody's reading them. So as a consequence of that, literacy is going up, and once they read that, especially in Scotland, what's going to happen is the literacy rate is going to skyrocket because of reading the Bible. And then people are going to start reading other things like Greek philosophy and laws and Roman history, and even stuff from the Middle East, stuff about Islamic history and Islamic ideas in philosophy, and in some cases almost like scientific and medical texts that they've been translated from Arabic to Greek to Latin, from Aramaic and Jewish into Italian, into Spanish, into French, into English, and all this stuff is happening. This is what we call the Renaissance. And I won't talk about the Italian Renaissance, which happens quite a bit earlier, several hundred years, but the English Renaissance is delayed for multiple reasons. But after the Reformation, all of these things, they've already penetrated, they've already been in England, but the access to them sort of widens. And then it's possible for you to get a person like Shakespeare to exist, a person who is not hyper educated like Queen Elizabeth and her brother and sister. He doesn't speak 5 languages. He hasn't studied all the philosophical and religious texts, for the last 2,000 years. But he has gone to grammar school. He has gone to one of the schools that Edward, in his short life, opened in Stratford. He's gone to grammar school. He's learned languages. He's been exposed to Latin. He probably was a tutor to a rich family who had a private library. And in these times, there wasn't really public libraries the way we have them. If the best collections of books were rich people's libraries in their houses. So it's quite possible, we're fairly certain that William Shakespeare was actually probably, not for sure, but probably secretly teaching a wealthy house's Catholic family tutoring their children. And while he was there, he had access to their library, which would have opened up, you know, all kinds of, his stories are often based on events in the Roman Empire, or events that are fantasy oriented, or set in Italy in the Renaissance. He talks about Greek philosophy, and he talks about the Trojan War and the myths and stuff. All these kind of texts are basically the core texts that would have existed in the library. So he never went to university, but you could have gotten exposure to that at Cambridge or Oxford. And so there's a whole group of English writers that at this point, the English language has started to be able to have a vocabulary and have a cadence and have the ability to express complicated ideas. And, you know, one of the reasons the Catholic Church said you shouldn't read the Bible in English is because English can't express the beauty of the Bible. You can't write it. It doesn't have the capacity. Now people are starting to believe that it does. And Shakespeare and all his friends, not friends, but his contemporaries, Edmund Spenser and Ben Jonson and Christopher Marlowe and all the other playwrights, famous playwrights and poets, Sir Philip Sidney, there's a long list of them. It seems like there's sort of like an explosion of talent and ability. And it's not a coincidence. It's because all these people are exposed to new ideas. Queen Elizabeth has a lot to do with this because she is the one at the top. She loves dramas. She loves poetry. She encourages performances. The companies form. Other wealthy people in the court are into it too, partly because the Queen is. So there's a whole wealthy upper class supporting these art projects, these literary projects, these drama projects. And so they start building theaters, and it becomes a form of entertainment for poor people, because the poor people attend the shows. The rich people invest in the players, in the actors, and the production company. And the most expensive thing for them isn't the actors, because actors aren't, superstars in this day and age. They're considered, lower class people. The most expensive thing, interestingly, is the clothing, the costumes. The company that invests in performing plays has to pay the actors a little bit. They have to have a building, which is expensive. But the most expensive thing they have is the collection of costumes and props. So when the Globe Theatre burns down, even though the building is on fire, everybody risks their lives to pull all of these trunks and boxes of expensive clothing and swords and props and accessories and crowns and stuff that they need to perform their plays. And they've managed to get all of that stuff out, and they're relieved. Even though the building burned down, now you can rebuild the building at a lower cost than it would be to replace hundreds of pieces of clothing that you need to perform Macbeth and Hamlet and Midsummer Night's Dream and King Lear. Those things would be almost that would almost bankrupt you if you lost all your costumes. So Shakespeare is the greatest. He's considered the greatest writer of English of all time in most cases. At least he was the greatest of the 16th century. We can't argue with that. He was admittedly, by the time he died, the greatest dramatist in English history, and contributed to the recognition of English as a superior language, as a language that was capable of expressing high art, the highest forms of ideas. And Shakespeare has been translated into 150 languages by now. So his effect in England was immediate. Some people think that he wasn't famous in his own lifetime. He was. He was well known, he was famous, but he wasn't a party animal, and he didn't socialize in public is much. He was more of a. It seems like he was more of a private person who kept amongst his own social circles. So he wasn't really flaunting his wealth. He accumulated a bunch of property, and when he died, he was admitted to the gentry. So his family got a crest, and he became a lesser gentleman. And that was his goal, I think, was just to work hard and to, explore the beauty of the human spirit, and to put together scenarios that people could understand the human condition better. And I think he really did a good job of accomplishing that. So that's my promotion of Shakespeare. I know he's difficult to read, but once you get a handle on how he writes and what he's trying to say, I really think he writes the most beautifully of all the English writers. Queen Elizabeth had chronic money problems. Please remember this. She had her own solutions. One of the solutions the biggest problem is she couldn't raise taxes. One of the reasons was that she was a woman and she had to be careful. But more than that, her grandfather and her father and her older sister and her brother, they didn't raise taxes. Now, the problem is the price of things, inflation, unlike in the Middle Ages, was pretty stable. Costs of things have been increasing steadily. But the tax that the government is collecting has not. So by the time Queen Elizabeth dies, because she doesn't raise the taxes, the taxes are going to be about 100 years out of date, which means the expenses of the crown, of the kingdom, are going to be way higher than the taxes they collect. And after 100 years has passed, it's very hard to adjust it by saying, okay, everybody's got to pay 30% more taxes next year. You can imagine if the Korean government did that. Yoon Suk-yeol just said, okay, actually we're short about 30% of our tax revenue because we've been making mistakes for like 25 years. So next year, everybody's got to pay 30% more tax, okay? No, that's not going to fly. There's going to be a revolution. So she literally can't. What she can do is just, when she needs money, she can get a specific tax for supporting a war or for a project or something. So 7 times she goes to Parliament and she asks for money in the form of like a one-time tax, but she can't raise the annual tax without infuriating everyone. So the taxes, she can't do that. I told you already, she's got her own kind of pirates, the privateers. She's got that, right? She has this thing also she can do. They're called monopolies. And a monopoly, as you understand it, is just one company has complete control over one product. This kind of monopoly is a little bit different. These monopolies mean that you have the ability to tax one product. So if I'm the king, and let's say my duke, we'll just say my Duke Seungmin. Seungmin is my duke, and I say, Seungmin, I don't have any money to give you. You're already a duke. You're already wealthy. What can I do? I will let you have the monopoly on soap. Okay? So everybody who's selling soap in the kingdom, they are selling their soap at a certain price, and Duke Seungmin, I don't know why a Korean guy's in the 16th century, but it's a familiar name for you guys. It could be Duke John, but it's Duke Seungmin. Seungmin, he decides he's gonna take 10 cents. 10 cents on every bar of soap is gonna be the levy. So whenever somebody sells a bar, they gotta pay this little like surtax, and he collects it. So he doesn't own the company. He doesn't make the soap. Just all soap that's sold in the entire kingdom has a small percentage that is just sort of paid as like a dividend to the owner of the monopoly. She gives these as kind of favors to her favorites, to the people who do good stuff for her. She doesn't have a lot of money. She can't give gifts of money or land. She doesn't have land either. So she gives them a title and she gives them a monopoly. This is very unpopular, and her entire reign, they're trying to make her get rid of them, but she manages through her intelligence and political savvy to continue this policy of monopolies. The pirates make her lots of money. Obviously, there's some, she's making money from trade, and some of this money is the privateering. Is they're bringing home gold that's stolen. Some of it's trade, and some of it's stolen. So there's trade and monopolies and pirates, and then she she of course she borrows money. So she does all these things to keep her budget, to sustain her budget. But what she really needs to do is raise taxes, but she can't. She's unable to do that. And it's going to be a problem for the next person after her, because he's going to have the same thing. The taxes need to be corrected, but to correct them would make him incredibly unpopular. And since Queen Elizabeth dies and she doesn't have a son or a daughter, it ends up being her nephew, like her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, has a son who becomes King of Scotland, and he's the closest relative. So he becomes the King of Scotland and the King of England. He'll be King James the Sixth of Scotland and King James the First of England, and that's a story for another day. Another thing that Queen Elizabeth did, as a result of the Spanish Armada and as a result of fighting against the Spanish for over 10 years. At the beginning, they really didn't have a proper fleet, but they have to. In order to protect themselves from the Spanish. They go from having small pirate ships and fishing boats and transport ships and trading ships to actually having a real navy. So a lot of people consider Queen Elizabeth the founder of the English Navy, of the British Navy. Actually, the truth is Henry VIII was the one who started building ships for the Navy. So even though he didn't have any successful battles or didn't do anything very impressive with it the way Queen Elizabeth did, she did over and over, had amazing victories on the ocean. It was actually Henry VIII that started building it. So in some sense, Henry VIII is actually the father of the Navy. But Queen Elizabeth is famous because some of the greatest naval battles in British history, in particular the Battle of the Spanish Armada in 1588, happened when she was the queen. And of course, Francis Drake and John Hawkins and Walter Raleigh and those other famous captains, they're well known too. Whereas in Henry VIII's age, there really wasn't any of these heroes like Yi Sun-shin or Lord Nelson type guys who were having adventures and winning great victories on the sea. So that also helps. So Queen Elizabeth didn't spend a lot of money. She couldn't, but she did support the arts, and she did have, lavish ceremonies. She did perform. She did have a beautiful court, lots of music, poetry, drama, performances, entertainment. She knew how to look like a monarch. She knew how to impress people, and she always dressed immaculately, with her everything perfectly arranged, and always had beautiful, expensive clothing on. And as I said, after she got to a certain age, and it showed, after she was about 40 years old and she started to lose her good looks, all images of her were frozen at that time. So even though she lived another 25 years, they never painted any pictures of her looking any different. So you just don't see what Queen Elizabeth looks like in her old age, because she's at the oldest, paintings or symbols or carvings or impressions of her or coins, they all preserve her as she was in her early middle age, or in the case of her time period, her late middle age. You've probably seen coins of the Queen. If you see Canadian money or British money too, you don't see, before Queen Elizabeth II died, you didn't see the image of her on the back of the coin. hadn't changed in about 40 years either. They didn't show her being 99 years old. So I guess that still hasn't changed. So the compromise means that there's sort of a settlement between Catholics and moderate Protestants and radical Protestants. There's kind of three groups here. And when Queen Elizabeth dies, they're all getting along. So that's important, right? What else do I need to say here? You need to read, like I said, you need to read up now to page 112. Okay? It talks a little bit about the English Book of Prayer and the Bible. The Bible is going to be commissioned by King James, so I'll talk about that in the next lecture. I have one more to do. This is sort of, this is the 16th century Renaissance, and the next one I'm going to talk about the 17th century and how the Civil War comes about because of these three factors, and plus the royal personality aggravates them. And I'm going to talk about the Puritan Revolution, Oliver Cromwell, Charles II, and get us to the end of, like I said, get us to page 120. So for this lecture, you can go to page 112, and then we'll cover the next 8 pages up to when we talk about John Locke and Isaac Newton, which, as I told you, that's not on the quiz. So this lecture covers up to page 112, and then one more cyber lecture to 120, and that's all the material for the quiz. Thank you for listening, and keep all those important points that I mentioned about Queen Elizabeth in mind, because those are going to be key questions on the quiz and on the midterm. Have a good day.